Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that lets you explore some of the most interesting countries in the world, highlighting their geopolitics, history, and culture. And it also allows you to hear some great stories and be introduced to some very interesting people along the way. Today, we are starting a new country, and it is one that I've put off a little bit, frankly, because it was not the best experience in my international career. I'll be real enough to admit that to you. There were many reasons for that, and I'll talk about those. But Bosnia and Herzegovina was an enigma wrapped in a riddle. If you're in the international development business long enough, and I've told many of my colleagues this over the years, you will eventually hit a project or a country that represents that white whale, like Captain Ahab in the famous book, where whatever you try doesn't seem to elicit the results that you hope. Just like in Moby Dick, Captain Ahab chased this elusive whale. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, I drew upon every skill, every bit of experience that I had to try to make the project that we were running, the Growth-Oriented Local Development Project, or GOLD it was called, an unequivocated success. And yet at every turn, it seemed like there were obstacles. Some of those obstacles were speed bumps that we were able to get over, but some of those obstacles were akin to 20-foot high brick walls that seemed to just stop momentum in their tracks. It frustrated me. It exhausted me. It literally made me physically ill. And I can truthfully say that it was the lowest point in my international development experience of more than 25 years. I will also say, though, that it's the project on which I probably learned the most, not only about the business, but about myself. And what I learned about myself there was a real wake-up call for me, and showed me that I had really lost my way, and that I needed to recalibrate everything that I thought I knew about myself and about the international development business. And I was able to do that and move forward from there. So let's jump into a discussion of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Debbie and I arrived there in the summer of 2013. As I said, to take over a USAID-funded project called the Growth-Oriented Local Development GOLD Project, one of the best acronyms of any project that I ever ran, just because it was an economic growth project and GOLD is a cool acronym. That's where USAID's success in this project really stopped, however. A great acronym, but a very poorly designed project, and a project that was very difficult for any implementing partner to gain traction on. Not just because of its structural design, but because of the individuals who were leading that project from the USAID side, and I'll talk more about that later. However, I will say that the team that we put together for the GOLD project was a good team. It had a lot of very motivated and talented people on the team. But I want to go back again to this example that I've used before in this podcast of Jim Collins in the book Good to Great. In that book, Jim Collins talks about having the right people on your bus, meaning having the right people in your organization, but also having those people in the right seats on the bus to ensure that you get the most out of their skills and experience and passion for the work. But I will truthfully say that we had some of the wrong people on the bus in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We had some of the wrong people on the project. Not that they weren't talented, not that they weren't motivated in their own way. But in Bosnia, there had been one USAID-funded project after another, or one donor-funded project after another. And many of these professionals, the Bosnian professionals, had cycled through from one project to another. And what I inherited in the gold project, from the standpoint of those who had been included in the bid, were largely individuals who just saw our work as another project that would lead them to the next project, another stepping stone to where they were going. They did not see it as their mission or their passion, where they woke up every day and said, this is what we want to do today, and we're going to do our best today to make this project a success. There were some on the project that did, in fact, wake up every morning feeling that way, but there were some who did not, and regrettably, some of those who did not were in leadership of the project from the standpoint of being some of the most senior Bosnian professionals on the project. But even so, we had some great people. I think about Elmir Halabic, one of our interpreters who was just fantastic, Amir Sarilic, Marima Avdajic, Dinka Majonovic, Edin Kulov, Aldin Halabic, Armin Cholak. These were just salt of the earth people. And there were many more as well. And I'll talk about all of those that I just mentioned during the course of this episode. But they tried hard. But this project, from almost day one, was like running in quicksand. The interesting thing is that when Debbie and I arrived in Sarajevo, we came from Jordan via Tunisia, and because those were very heavily Islamic cultures, Bosnia seemed almost a breath of fresh air. There were families out walking the streets together and playing, and it seemed to be a very low-key, relaxed environment. Somewhat more structured than the environments that we'd come from in the Middle East and North Africa. And yet, below the surface, there were systematic and endemic challenges that very quickly we were able to ascertain. And one of those challenges, the biggest challenge in my mind, was the USAID mission at that time in Bosnia and Herzegovina itself. That mission was almost totally dominated by the Bosnians who worked there. Many of them were fantastic. Regrettably, the contracting officer's representative, COR, or the USAID liaison or leader of our project, was not one of those people. I won't say her full name here because It would be wrong of me to do so. But Amira was a force to be reckoned with, and not in a good way. Up until that time, I had been blessed to have some of the greatest USAID colleagues to work with anywhere. My contracting officers representatives had been fantastic. The mission directors had been great. The department heads. It had really been a pleasure up until that time to work with all the USAID missions and the personnel with which I had worked. But Amira and her deputy, Vlado, were two people that very early on I realized that it was very likely they did not have our best interest at heart. And this project, because of the way it was designed, was difficult enough without dealing with two individuals who were supposed to be supporting you that instead seemed to be working against you at every turn. I remember so many times, even early on in the project, getting calls from Amira that literally I had never had a call like that from a USAID representative anywhere. Angry, confrontational, disingenuous, a very toxic situation. But it wasn't only their fault, it was my fault as well. Because early on, once I made the decision that they didn't have our best interest at heart, I decided to turn this into a battle. And it was a battle that ultimately I was not going to win, because the client is the client. Whether they're right or whether they're wrong, they're still your client. But I made the determination that they're disingenuous, they're not working in the best interest of not just our project or our company, but the people of Bosnia. And we were not going to play that game. We were going to do what was best for the people of Bosnia, whether or not Amira thought it was the best. One can say that it was a battle of two people who both thought they were right. And what I learned from this struggle over the period of time that I was in Bosnia is that you have to pick the hill on which you want to die. And you can't fight everything. There were many times I should have just let things go. The snide remarks, the snarky emails, I should have just let it go. But I didn't. I fought fire with fire. And if you fight fire with fire, somebody's going to get burned. And nobody emerged from this unscathed. It damaged me, it damaged her, it damaged our team. And it's something that I'm certainly not proud of in the way I reacted to the whole situation, but it's something that I learned a lot from. And I think it was a turning point for me to realize that I have to approach not just a project, but life in a different way. When we moved to Sarajevo, we realized that it was quite a pleasant place to live. We leased a house on the other side of the Miljaka River on the hillside near the Jewish cemetery. By the way, the Jewish cemetery where Serbian snipers used to sight their rifles on headstones and pick people off in the streets during the siege of Sarajevo, which we'll talk more about. It was very close to that cemetery, so it was bad juju from the very beginning, probably. And I really began to dig into the history and the culture of this country. One of the first things I did was go out and buy this book called Bosnia, A Short History by Noel Malcolm. It's a great book to understand the context of Bosnia, which is a supremely complex country. So we had a very complex and poorly designed project in a very complicated environment that was led from the USAID side by individuals who were disingenuous and toxic, and led on my side by me, who made the decision that we were going to fight every fight and not let anything go. And so you can see the toxicity that could develop in that situation. But when I say that Bosnia was a challenging place, there are many reasons for it. We'll talk about many of those, but it was very challenging for Bosnians, especially Bosniaks, which was a predominant ethnic group within the country, to remember the good times. And there had been good times. One of the things that almost all of them could agree on was that the Winter Olympics in 1984 had been one of the happiest times they could remember, and it came just before everything fell apart. Tito had died in 1980, the Yugoslavian leader, and things began to move in a negative direction throughout Yugoslavia, and certainly in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. But in 1984, all the ethnic groups that inhabit that geography, the Bosniaks, the Serbs, the Croats, they came together to host the 1984 Olympics, and it was a beautiful spectacle. I stood in the hall, which is now a shopping center, where Torval and Dean got their perfect 10 in ice dancing. Still one of the most beautiful performances in Olympic history that happened right there in Sarajevo. In that same hall, Scott Hamilton won gold in men's figure skating. Katharina Witt from Germany won gold in women's figure skating. It was a beautiful time in the recent history of Bosnia, just before things crumbled. It might have taken another 7 years for the wheels to come off, but the wheels were certainly wobbling even in 1984. You know, what's interesting is after that Olympic Games, they developed an Olympic museum in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and that museum was shelled by the Serbs during the siege of Sarajevo from 1992 to 1996, and almost all of the memorabilia from those Olympic Games were destroyed. I talked to the man who had directed the museum for many years and befriended him somewhat, and he told me one day that they had several of the original Olympic posters in a safe that was in the basement of this building. And when it got shelled, they survived. And before I left Bosnia, he actually gave me one of those posters, which hangs on the wall of my office now, one of the remaining Olympic posters of the 1984 Games. I also, while I was there, came home with an Olympic participation medal that all of the athletes got that participated in the games. that says Sarajevo 1984, and those are two prized possessions of mine because they remind me of a time of happiness that I didn't get to see in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I saw what came after, and we were trying to address what came after, and what came after was one of the worst genocides that you can imagine. Also, while I was in Sarajevo, I befriended the mayor of Sarajevo and was appointed to the commemoration committee of the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand, which, of course, was a seminal event that led to the starting of World War II. Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo, and that commemoration committee was put together to honor the 100th anniversary of an event that really changed Europe forever and changed the nature of war forever. So many other memories while I was there. Was in a flood, one of the worst floods they'd had in Bosnia in recent memory, and was stranded outside of Sarajevo for many days during that flood. Stayed in a really bad hotel in Tuzla, Bosnia, for several days. But our project was helping to provide relief for those cities, both in Bosnia and the Republika Srpska, that were affected by the flooding. And so we traveled throughout the country delivering aid during that time of flood. And I to this day, I feel good about what we did in helping people who had lost so much during that terrible flood. I remember the beautiful weekend that Debbie and I spent in Garage Day with our friend Edine, where he and his brother were making home brew in their still. And we got to eat great Bosnian food and interact with people in this very interesting city of Garage Day that had been so decimated during the Bosnian War. And like every project that we had, our drivers were always people that we loved and revered. And my main driver was a guy named Aldine, and he was just a fantastic guy. We drove all over that country, all hours of the day and night. And Aldine had this mixtape that he would always play, and I can still remember virtually every song on that mixtape. And one of them was the song Zombie. And that song, one part of that song says, in your head, there are voices. Delois O'Riordan, I'll never forget it. And that song really did stick in your head. And I would sit in the car and say, in your head, there's this song constantly. Aldine, please change the track. But he would just laugh and continue to play that mixtape. And when I got ready to leave Bosnia, he actually gave me that mixtape as a souvenir, and I still have it to this day. All those memories. Edin Chulov, Chola. Or Armin Cholak, Chola. He was called, who drove Debbie and I many times, and Debbie developed a great affinity for Chola. He had lost almost everything in the war. He'd fought for Bosnia. He had given of himself so much for that country and came home to devastation, had to take care. His father had been killed. He had to take care of his mother and his sisters, and yet had such a beautiful spirit about him. One day, Debbie and I were in the tunnel museum in Sarajevo. There was a tunnel that ran from the airport into the city, which was the only way to get in supplies during the siege of Sarajevo because the Serbs had Sarajevo completely surrounded. And so the Bosniaks built this tunnel to bring in some meager supplies so that people could live, and they also would bring weapons and soldiers through those tunnels as well. Part of that tunnel still exists, and there's a museum there. And in that museum, there's a picture of a Bosnian Special Forces soldier sitting in the tunnel, leaning over his rifle like this with a very dejected and exhausted look on his face. And we stood there looking at that picture and then looked at Chola. And Debbie said, "Chola, that's you." And he said, "Yeah, that's me." And then he showed us his father's name on the memory wall where he'd been killed in the war, and all of his comrades, his friends that he had lost during the war, during a time where Bosnia was literally under siege. All those memories. And yet, the thing that I focused most on from the time in Bosnia was the fact that it was the riddle I couldn't solve. Did our project fail? No. It achieved some nice impact. But it was so far below what it could have been. It was so far below my expectations. Because everything was just a struggle. From working with the USAID mission to challenges within our own team. And it's the only project that I left early. I had the opportunity to go and replace a chief of party in West Bank, Gaza, that had been dismissed. And I elected to do that because by that time the relationship with Amira and her deputy, Vlado at USAID, had deteriorated to the point where we were never going to be able to work together. The team was negatively affected by this whole relationship, and I felt like it was the best thing for them for me to leave and move on to another assignment. The person who replaced me, by the way, was sent away by USAID, terminated by USAID. The person that replaced him had the same kind of relationship with Amira, and it was just a fight until the end of that project because for whatever reason, and I'll never know the reasons why she reacted the way that she did and chose to be the way that she chose to be. But the fact is that even those who followed me, who tried to do everything that she wanted, regardless whether it made sense or not, still didn't satisfy her. And caused us not to achieve with that project all that we wanted to achieve. So, complicated place, complicated project. Wrapped up in all of this conflict and drama. How did we get there? Well, I think that to understand that, you have to understand the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina. First off, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and I talked about this during my episode with Kosovo. Following the Allied victory in World War II, Yugoslavia was set up as a federation of 6 republics with borders drawn along ethnic and historical lines. There was Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Slovenia. And in addition, there were 2 autonomous states within Serbia, which is Vojvodina and Kosovo. Slovenia and Croatia voted for independence on June 25th, 1991. That began the process of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. As I said in previous episodes on Serbia and Kosovo and Montenegro, Marshal Tito, Josip Broz Tito, was a strong man. He had managed to keep Yugoslavia together and to manage all the ethnic conflict within Yugoslavia. But once he was gone, once he passed away in 1980, things began to move in the wrong direction. And you had leaders in both Bosnia and Serbia who really focused more on ethnic lines. And this became a toxic cocktail that created the conflict within that region. So the first to go were Slovenia and Croatia. And then Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence in March of 1992, but it wasn't realized until April 6th, 1992. Now, Serbia did not react well to the breakup of Yugoslavia. When Slovenia and Croatia voted for independence, the Serbs immediately took action and there was fighting. Same happened with Bosnia and Herzegovina. In March of 1992, when it voted for independence, the Serbs began to mass at the borders and prepare for a conflict. And that conflict spilled over on April 6, 1992, which is when the international community recognized Bosnia and Herzegovina's independence and the official day that the Bosnian War started. When we talk about the Bosnian War, we're talking about the events that occurred from April 6, 1992 through November 15, 1995. Although those dates are a little bit fluid, and I'll tell you why in just a few moments. Following several earlier violent incidents, the war started on April 6, 1992, when the newly independent Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina was internationally recognized. It ended on the 21st of November 1995 with the Dayton Accords. The main belligerents were the forces of the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the breakaway proto-states of the Republic of Herzegovina and Republic of Srpska, which were led and supplied by Croatia and Serbia, respectively, because by this time, Croatia had a Serbian-aligned government. Through the horribleness of this war, almost 31,000 Bosnian military personnel were killed. More than 20,000 Serbian soldiers were killed, and more than 31,000 civilians, and those are conservative estimates. But this period of war was most defined by a series of incidents that occurred during that period. And one of those was the siege of Sarajevo, which occurred from April the 6th, 1991 through February 29th, 1996. Now you might say, okay, but the Dayton Accords were signed in November 1995. Why did the siege last until 1996? And that is because the Serbs for some time refused to acknowledge the Dayton Accords and continued to encircle the capital city of Sarajevo. If you do the math on that, Sarajevo was under siege for 1,425 days, which is the longest siege of a European capital in history. It started that day in April of 1992 with an incident on one of the bridges across the river, where Swada Delimovic and Olga Sucic were killed as they came across a bridge with the Miljaka River bridge with protesters who were in support of Bosnia's independence, and the Serbs opened fire on them. And from that time on, Sarajevo essentially was surrounded by Serbian forces. this was a horrid time in not just the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also I would argue it was a horrid time in the history of Serbia as well, because it exposed a lot of things in Serbian society that they didn't want exposed. This book is one of the best memoirs of that time that I've read. It's called Goodbye Sarajevo. It's about two sisters who were separated during that period of time. One took refuge in Croatia, the other stayed in Sarajevo. And it is a very poignant book that highlights many of the stories that I heard over and over while I was in Bosnia. Here's the thing. The 1990s was a violent decade. There were a lot of wars during that decade. You had the Rwandan genocide during that period. You had the wars in Kosovo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Croatia. It was just a challenging period globally. But once those wars were over, most of these countries, the people of these countries, found a way to move forward. I would argue that the Bosnians never did. I mean, even at the time that I was there, that I arrived in 2013, the war had been over for, 17 years? And yet you could barely have a conversation with someone, with a Bosniak or a Serb, that didn't in some way reference the war. You heard story after story from both sides about things that had happened. You still had buildings that showed the signs of war with mortar holes in them. The National Museum was closed. There were cemeteries all over the city that reminded one of war dead. There were monuments all over the city. There were markers where the front lines used to be. Emotions were still raw after all these years because no one had solved the problem. The Dayton Accords were initiated to stop the killing. And at some level, I understand that. Everybody wanted the killing stopped. But what the Dayton Accords put in place was an unsustainable government. And it did very little, if anything, to address the issues that had caused this conflict to begin with. It didn't bring the Serbs and the Bosniaks and the Croats closer together. It simply drew lines and put in place governmental structures to try to give everybody what they wanted. And in doing so, it made Bosnia and Herzegovina almost ungovernable. I'll tell you why. The Dayton Accords put in place a federal government. But it also put in place the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the government of the Republika Srpska, and also an autonomous region as well. And so you had all these overlapping governmental structures, but you had no or nascent ability to really drive progress as a country should, because these governmental structures overlapped, in some ways worked even in opposition to each other, and you still had all the ethnic divisions that you had before, even complicated by this little region of Brčko that was essentially doing its own thing. it was a mess. If you designed something from day one that you were sure would not work, that would have been the Dayton Accords. And it's proven even to this day. Bosnia and Herzegovina would love to join the European Union, but they're far away from doing that because their governmental structure simply does not, and I would argue cannot, work. The United States and the EU and Western allies were very supportive of Bosnia and Herzegovina, spent literally tens of millions of dollars on projects like the one I ran. And progress was made, but if the governmental structure had been in any way compatible with a reasonable approach to governance, that impact could have been substantial. And the U.S. aid mission there at that time, under different leadership later on, it became much better. But at that time, the U.S. aid mission was a microcosm of everything that was wrong with the country. Conflict-oriented, drama-oriented, disingenuous. Bosnians ran the mission. They had their own agendas. It was an absolute mess. And it made working in Bosnia and Herzegovina exhausting. And the more that I worked, the more that I tried to lead, the more that I pushed, the more difficult it became. I didn't realize it at the time, but in addition to everything else that was happening, I was sick. Later on, after I left Bosnia and Herzegovina, I was diagnosed with pre-stage 1 cancer. Had an operation, and fortunately, everything has been fine ever since. But in addition to just psychologically having a hard time dealing with the challenges in Bosnia, I was physically ill as well. And this caused migraines where I would be debilitated for days at a time with migraines. I continued to work. But you can imagine the decision-making process that you make with a migraine is quite different than the decision-making process you would probably make with a clear head. And so all this pressure, everything swirling around me, and then the migraines and the physical ailment and the exhaustion, it took a terrible toll. And it made me the kind of person that I didn't want to be and should not have been. And Debbie is an actual saint for tolerating the types of anger and stress that I put myself through and I put her through during that period. Certainly there were bright spots and good times. I've outlined some of those. But from the standpoint of my own health and my own ability to create the kind of impact that I wanted to be associated with in the Gold Project, it was a very, very distinct uphill climb. And so you can begin to see, with all these things coming together, the dysfunctional government, the challenging U.S. aid mission, the structure of the project, the personalities involved, the specter of the war that still enveloped everything like a black cloud. It made progress hard to achieve. while I was there, I visited a town of Srebrenica. If you don't know much about Bosnia, you may not know, but during the war, Srebrenica was the site of one of the worst massacres in recent history. From July 11th to 31st, 1995, there was a horrible genocide that was perpetuated on Srebrenica. And it was interesting because Srebrenica was considered a safe zone. It was controlled by the Dutch battalion called Dutchbat. But during this period that I just mentioned, 8,372 boys and men were executed by the Serbian military and paramilitaries. 25,000 to 30,000 women and children were abused and forcibly transferred. Women, large numbers of women, were raped. And the Serbian soldiers and paramilitaries under the command of Ratko Mladic are those who perpetuated the genocide. And the Dutch battalion did virtually nothing to stop it. It happened right under their noses. Literally, it happened with them standing by and watching, and they did nothing. Mladic was later convicted in The Hague and sentenced to life in prison. He remains in prison to this day. In the next episode on Bosnia and Herzegovina, which will cover Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, we'll talk about more about the period of war and some of the personalities who were involved, who perpetuated the atrocities on both sides of that conflict. That'll take a whole episode to get through that. But I wanted you to really understand the complexity of the environment in which my team and I were working at that time, and the environment in which Debbie and I were living. I remember walking out of the office on some days and just not going home right away, just walking up and down the Miljacka River and going through in my mind the scenarios of how to fix this. How can I fix this issue? How can I generate momentum? And you can understand by those statements how lost I was, because I couldn't do anything. I put all the pressure on myself to fix something that no one person could fix on their own. I didn't use my team in the right way. And I lost the ability to reason in a way that would help us achieve the most desirable results. One weekend, when Debbie was out of the country, I went with my driver up to the mountainside above Sarajevo to the site of where the Olympic bobsled had occurred. And during the war, most of the sites got ruined. There was part of this bobsled track that was still intact, and it was filled with graffiti and trash. But I wanted to go see it. So I went up there, and Aldine took a picture of me sitting on the side of that ruined bobsled track. And I look at that picture now. I look at just the look on my face and the condition of the track itself and everything that was going on around me. And it was really a metaphor for my time there. I looked miserable, and I was in a site that had once been one of happiness and joy during the Olympics that turned into one of misery and conflict. And I still have a difficult time in analyzing or doing an after action on everything that happened there. And this is really the first time that I've talked openly about it. I wrote about it in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way, but this is really the first time that I have talked about it, because that pain still runs deep. I will tell you. There were a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of tears, a lot of anger. And when I left there, it was like a yoke fell off of me. But even as I did, the self-inflicted wounds that I had undergone while I was there continued to linger. Every now and then I'll revisit my time in Bosnia. I'll read some books or I'll look through photographs. And the other day I came across this book, The Bridge Over the Drina by Ivo Andrić. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature for this book in 1961. This is an English language copy of it. And it really reflects the mindset of the Bosnian people as well as anything that I've ever read. I would encourage you to get a copy of it. I believe that there are English language copies of it available on Amazon. So what I've tried to do today is to set the stage for the episode to come, which will have a heavily focus on that period between 1992 and 1996 of the Bosnian War. Because all of that, like structures built on top of each other, created this society in which Bosnia and Herzegovina operates to this day. So I hope you'll join me for the next episode. It'll be emotional, it'll be raw. It won't be one that will put a smile on your face, because that period of history in Bosnia didn't put a smile on anybody's face. It was a horrible time that, in trying to address that, I will argue that Europe, the United States, made probably a necessary but unfortunate choice in the Dayton Accords as to how to address the issue. More to come on that in our next episode. Thanks for joining me today, and we will see you next Monday.